Okay, today we're moving on to another lesson in rhetoric after yesterday's lesson in finding purpose, where we talked about using what we know about kairos and author's exigence and the outside context and the rhetorical situation to determine purpose. Today we're going to talk a little bit about once the author is writing, how they shift from one idea to another. And we're going to be talking about recognizing shift and knowing what shift is. So the first thing you need to know is what is shift. So when we talk about shift in writing or in speaking, any kind of rhetoric, shift is an author or a speaker moving from one idea, tactic, tone to another in order to further his argument. So shifts are the way authors use manipulations of their audience in order to try to reach an agreement. So you can move from one idea or tactic to the next in order to get someone to agree with you. Shifts help the writer move from this idea to the next in order to create a progression in their argument and to get people to go along with them and what they're saying. Okay, so authors use shifts because of the rhetorical triangle. Remember we talked about the speaker, the audience, and the subject or topic and how they all play together. A speaker has to know his audience in order to know what to write about and how to write about it. So the triangle isn't set in stone, it's fluid, which means that if the audience changes, then the way that you speak about it changes. The same thing happens because audiences are also fluid. So you could begin with an audience that doesn't agree with you, and as you continue to speak or write, the audience begins to agree with you. So the tactics that you use early change as you go throughout the piece. So you as a writer or a speaker need to be able to shift as your audience shifts. So for example, because I have to use motivation and manipulation tactics in order to get someone to change, I'll give you an example of how I might do that. I used to direct theater, and all the time I would see someone in class who had never done theater before, and I'd want to go up to this person and try to convince him or her to join theater. So I would have to try to figure out how to do that. So first, I might begin by flattering the student. Hey, I noticed in class that you're really good at reading aloud and you're really fluent, and I really feel what you're saying, and you don't seem to be shy in front of anyone. So my first tactic is using persuasion through flattery, trying to get this person to feel good about what I noticed about them. Then let's say I give some information. It's called expository mode. So now I'm moving into giving that person information, and I say, I don't know if you've ever thought about joining theater, but I'm the theater director, and this year we're doing a play called blah, 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 and it's about blah, blah, blah. So I give information, expository. Then I move into using another mode of rhetoric called narration, where I tell a story. I give my experience or someone else's experience. You know, I first started doing theater when I was your age, and I was really excited about all the different things that I could do. So I joined a group. I got to meet some of my best friends in theater, and what I thought started out just as being something fun turned into a career that I wanted to do, and I think you'd be really good at it. Then finally, I might go into description mode, where I start to use appeals and tone and things like that to convince someone to join theater. So I could describe the feeling of how it feels when the curtain rises for the first time, describing the closeness that you get with your classmates and your stage mates, cast mates, and how that feels when you're part of the group. And then I'm using description. The problem is that when your audience changes, you need to know how to change your rhetoric. So the way I would approach a hostile audience would be different than the way I would approach a supportive one. So when I was directing theater, I could tell when someone would be more open to joining theater than when someone would be like, buzz off, lady, I'm not interested at all. But I might still want that person to join theater, the buzz off person, in which case I have to get them to come to some sort of common ground agreement with me, which means that I change the tactic that I use, which means that I shift my tone and I shift the purpose behind what I'm saying. Does that make sense? All right. Next. How do you know when shifting is about to occur? Well, the thing is that nobody wants to know that they're being manipulated. So the best speakers and writers and convincers try not to make it so obvious that they're shifting tactics, right? So because of that, shifts can be hard to find sometimes because they can be really subtle. And sometimes two people can read the same piece of writing, even people who have the same advanced degree in English, and not be able to agree on where the shifts occur because our unique backgrounds cause us to read into other people's tones. So where I might see a reprimanding tone coming from Abigail Adams in the letter to her son, someone else who maybe wasn't necessarily raised as strictly by their parents as I would, could see more of a soft, comforting tone. The point is that most of the time we can see shifts that occur regardless of whether we agree on the tone or not. So in general, the better that a writer or a speaker knows the audience, the easier it is for them to make obvious shifts because the audience will forgive them. So one way to shift is through transitions. So there's a lot of different types of transitions. Two types are contrast transitions, like however, yet, nonetheless, but, transitions like that, that show that you're going in one direction and you're about to change. Then there are other kinds of transitions called intensifying or illustrative transitions, like indeed, to illustrate, of course, without a doubt, where it shows agreement and you're adding to the argument that you already made. That's still a shift, even though you're showing agreement and adding to it because you might be getting more specific. So there's a lot of different universities that have writing labs. My favorite is the Badger Writing Lab for reason. The Writing Center at Wisconsin-Madison has this list of transitional words and phrases, and it's all divided into adding on, shifting in time, shifting in place, exemplification, illustration, comparison, contrast, all these different transitions listed that help us indicate that a shift is coming. This is a really good place to look for if you want to find more information about shift. But the online writing lab at Purdue, the OWL, also has great transitions, and all you have to do is Google in list of transitions, and it'll take you there so you can kind of see what the different transitions do if you don't know a lot about it. We'll be looking at that more when we go into our own writing, and I start to ask you to use transitions to indicate a shift in your own rhetoric. Okay. There are 4 different types of shifts that I can think of, but if you can think of more, awesome, add to it. There is shift in mode, shift in time or tense, shift in topic or focus, and shift in tone. So we're going to talk about each of these in detail so that you can understand a little bit more about that, and we're going to do that in a minute. Okay, let's talk about the different types of shift in more detail. So we're going to begin by talking about shifts in mode. And mode is basically like the type of writing that occurs. So there's 4 different mode shifts that, the powers that be recognize as being different modes of writing: expository, descriptive, persuasive, and narrative. So expository writing, expository mode, is where you're providing information, and it's usually a logical appeal. So let's say, for example, when I was telling you that theater story, I said I might go into an expository mode where I'm giving information, and I tell the student, we have this theater group, we're doing this play, I'm the director, here's when auditions are. That's expository mode, basically relaying information and informing someone of something. Then there's descriptive mode. Descriptive mode is where you go into detail through description to make someone feel as though they are there in the place where they are. It's typically an appeal to pathos, emotion, appeal, to get someone, in the position that they maybe have never been in before. So when I describe what it's like to be in a play and when the curtain rises for the first time, just in general giving that description, that's descriptive mode. It happens most frequently in fiction, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in nonfiction. The next one is persuasive mode, and that's using all of these different tactics to get someone to agree with you. Persuasive mode is clearly appealing to both pathos, logos, and in some case, ethos. All those Aristotelian appeals we use for persuasive mode. And we'll take a look at some of that, the way that we persuade someone. The next is narrative mode, and that is just like a narrative essay, it's using a story, a personal story, or someone else's personal story to like convince someone of something. So if I tell how I started in theater and what it's done for me, that's using narrative mode to convince someone. So time and tense. So this is where a writer uses chronological transitions. First I did this, next there was this, a little bit later in the year. And you can shift time and tense with foreshadowing and flashback as well. So you don't necessarily have to go forward in a straight line, but change things around. You can also use different verb tenses. For example, I used to enjoy going to theater when I was a student. Now I love theater because I'm a director and I like to see students use theater in their own way. So there's a shift right in the middle of that sentence that I'm using from what I did in the past to what I do now. The next shift is topic and focus shift, which could go into further detail or elaboration on a previous point. It could shift the focus from like a group of people to an individual person. So you can have that shift occur within some of the mode shifts, which we'll take a look at when we look at what we did before. And then last is tone shift. So someone's tone can change based on how they're persuading you. They can go from being cajoling, like, oh, come on, it'll be great, come on down to the theater, to being demanding. If you don't come to the theater, I swear I'm never going to work with you on another group project. So you can see the difference in those tones. Those tones also occur in our writing. Okay, now let's practice that idea of shifts with something that you already know what the sections are, Abigail Adams' letter to her son. And let's take a look at that to get an idea of what kind of shift is happening and where that shift is occurring in the passage. So we're going to start with the shift from section 1, which is the first 2 paragraphs right there, to section 2. In order to properly describe the shift that's occurring, you need to understand like the tone and the mode of the first section and the tone and the mode of the second section so that you can kind of use that in your explanation. So when we look at this closely, this I hope you have had no occasion either from enemies or the dangers of the sea through you will find your understanding opening and daily improving. Into this, some author that I have met with compares a judicious traveler to a river. So that shift right there, when we begin, the background, the context of the letter is included in section 1. What was going on prior to the letter, and kind of gives you a little bit about what the topic of the letter is going to be about. It's the context. It's somewhat persuasive in mode because she says things like, I hope you have had no occasion. I hope you will never have occasion yourself, nor give me reason to lament it. Your knowledge of the language, just like she's starting to list her reasons why it's a good idea for him to travel to France. So she goes from this kind of persuasive mode to a little bit of an expository mode, where she's furthering her information by a definite shift in topic from this background to the lesson of the letter, from persuasive to expository. So this personal tone to something a little bit more illustrative. And she talks here about this, what this author that she's known, and how he describes this river flowing. She gets a little descriptive in there as well, as she kind of talks about that. Okay, so we get the understanding of that. So the shift there is a mode shift from persuasive to expository. It's also this like focus shift from a personal focus on her son to something a little bit more educational, right? That she's kind of teaching him. And then she goes back to a little bit personal. Your improvement should bear under the proportion to your advantages. Nothing is lacking in you, is wanting in you, but attention, diligence, and steady application. Nature has not been deficient. Now, from section 2 to section 3, she goes from kind of general information about what happens when you travel abroad to something a little bit more descriptive. So she's got this kind of persuasive, descriptive tone to, again, definitely expository. So now she starts talking about Cicero and Catiline and Verus and Mark Antony and why they have their minds have been formed under great trials and tribulations. So it's a mini history lesson, what she's giving to him right there. So that becomes definitely more expository, definitely more teaching, more illustrative. Now we've got this great big shift word right there. Yet it is your lot, my son. There are two things that should be flags to you that this is a shift. Yet and my son. The yet indicates that there is a contrast that's coming, a contrasting transition. The my son indicates that now she's speaking back directly to him, where in the past she was back here, she was talking more specifically about those historical time periods. Now it's back to you. So focus goes from that historical examples, the expository, to being personally persuasive and comparing this time with that time. So it's kind of another mode shift from expository to persuasive that she's going. Okay, now we've got another shift to section 5. This is a shift in tone. The nor ought it to be one of the least of your incitements towards exhorting every power and faculty of your mind. You have a parent who has taken a large and active share in this contest. So who is she talking about there? She's talking about his father, not about her, because it's his father that he's traveling with. And so she goes a little bit inspirational here, talking about heaven and it's your turn to do great things just like these great heroes of the past. Now she gets a little bit more personal and more of a warning tone, kind of guilting him into feeling how important this trip is. His father has been discharged the trust reposed in him with so much satisfaction as to be honored with the important embassy which at present calls him abroad. So it's giving him an understanding of how important this trip is. A little more inspirational, motherly warning tone going on in from section 4 to section 5. And then there's the last shift. This is, typically the closing of a letter where someone's really trying to hit home what it is that they mean to say. So this goes from a shift in focus from his father's job to the focus of the son. And the focus change is meant to be comparable. So for example, this is a comparison. This is what your father is doing. This is the trust the nation puts in him. Now, what are you going to do? It gives me pleasing hopes you will not swerve from her dictates, but add justice, fortitude, and every manly virtue which can adore a good citizen. Do honor your country and render your parents supremely happy. So basically it's putting the ball back in his court. Now it's your turn again, and it's a focus shift from the father's job to the son's job. And it's a little bit more hopeful because she says she has pleasing hopes that you will do this. And then she ends, of course, particularly your ever affectionate mother. I like to think of Abigail Adams as using all of the powers that she has to guilt him into being happy to go to France, even though he's not or wasn't when he left. Okay, let's take a look at what I want you to do with all this. Now that you have a better understanding of shift, I want you to try it yourself. So I'm going to have you get out your passage from the summer reading, that 750 word passage that I gave you, and let's see if we can break this down into shifts. First, I want you to do it yourself and break it down into these where are the sections and where the shifts occur. And make sure you have a reason for choosing that shift. Then later, I'm going to have you compare with other people who read the book. Just because someone else chooses a different shift does not necessarily mean that you're wrong or they're wrong. You might just be looking at a shift in tone while they're looking at a shift in focus or a shift in rhetorical mode. But those are the things that I want you to look at. Is this going from expository to persuasive to descriptive to narrative? Is this a shift in time? Is this a shift in the tone of the piece, the purpose behind the piece? Just make sure you're really clear about understanding why exactly things are changing. Okay, let's see what we can do with this. Go ahead and get started.